French history has been marked by several violent and bloody revolutions.
Well, we often think about the big one from 1789, which profoundly transformed French society and inspired other countries around the world.
But there have been several modern uprisings as well that have given the French a somewhat rebellious reputation.
Join us as we unpack the legacy of these revolutions and explore what's left of France's revolutionary spirit.
We're here at the Place de la Bastille, where in 1789 the French Revolution began on July 14th, a date forever known as Bastille Day.
The medieval fortress called La Bastille was a political prison. At the time of its storming, there were only 7 inmates, but revolutionaries saw it as a symbol of the monarchy's abuse of power.
The Bastille prison was completely destroyed, but the revolution itself left an indelible mark on French society.
When we think about the legacy of the French Revolution, we often think about major advances in human rights laid out in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen from 1789.
That declaration was inspired by a philosophy called the Enlightenment, and it became the basis of a democratic nation of free individuals protected equally under the law.
But the bloody violence of the 10-year revolutionary period, especially the so-called Reign of Terror, almost overshadowed its advances and somewhat discredited it.
And nothing is more symbolic of that than the guillotine.
France's infamous beheading machine has always been an object of fear and fascination at home and abroad. Though designed by a doctor named Antoine Louis, it was named after a physician, Joseph Ignace Guillotin. Though he didn't invent the guillotine, he was its staunchest defender in France's new post-revolutionary National Constituent Assembly. As of 1789, he argued that the guillotine was the most humane and less painful form of execution. In many ways, it was very democratic. Royals, aristocrats, poor people, it was the same punishment for all. Following the revolution, the guillotine became the standard method of capital punishment in France. Executions were a popular form of entertainment that attracted large crowds of spectators, with vendors selling programs listing the names of the condemned. Over the years, it acquired all sorts of sordid names: la veuve, the widow; le rasoir national, the national razor; la bécane, the machine; or Louisette. The last time someone's head was chopped off was in 1977. 4 years before capital punishment was abolished in France in 1981. These days, the mere mention of la guillotine tends to send chills down people's spines.
Most of the revolutionary executions took place here at the Place de la Concorde, what was known back then as the Place de la Révolution, and a guillotine was set up not far from where we are now.
This is actually where the king, Louis XVI, was beheaded, as well as Marie Antoinette and other key figures from the revolution like Danton and Robespierre.
The revolutionary First Republic was followed by Napoleon and his empire, then a return to the monarchy, followed by a new republic and a new empire. It was a very turbulent period filled with a lot of revolution.
So much so that it's easy to get your revolutions mixed up. And a lot of you had questions, including you, Genie.
That's right. This is a question for all of my musical theater friends out there. Which French Revolution is portrayed in Les Mis, the musical that's based on the book by Victor Hugo?
Les Misérables. Well, that's actually a revolution that took place in 1830, known as the July Revolution. And it's also depicted in a very famous painting by Eugène Delacroix, La liberté guidant le peuple, liberty guiding the people.
There were so many uprisings in the 1800s, it's hard to keep track. But if you look carefully, you can still see traces of them in places like here in Paris.
The capital is full of clues about its rich past. Some of them point to a little-known and yet defining page in French history, the Paris Commune.
La Commune de Paris was a revolutionary socialist government that controlled Paris from March 18th to May 28th, 1871. It started as a brutal insurrection and ended in bloodshed.
But it was also a social laboratory that experimented with concepts central to modern-day France: equality between men and women, workers' rights, the separation of church and state. But over 150 years later, the legacy of La Commune continues to divide the country because it was incredibly violent. The government recaptured Paris after the so-called Bloody Week, in which thousands of communards were executed.
Here at the Père Lachaise cemetery, you can still see bullet impacts on the walls, where the last defenders of La Commune were executed and thrown into mass graves.
The communards, meanwhile, set fire to several buildings, including City Hall and the Palais des Tuileries. It's estimated that a third of the city was burned down, the worst destruction in the history of Paris.
But perhaps the most visible symbol of La Commune is one of Paris's most famous tourist attractions, the Sacré-Cœur Basilica.
Though planned before the bloody uprising, the first stone was laid shortly after, right on the spot where everything kicked off. For some, the church is a slap in the face to the memory of the secular communards. This might partially explain why some Parisians hate Sacré-Cœur so much. What's certain is that walking around the picturesque streets, it's hard to imagine the bloodshed and fighting that happened just about 150 years ago.
Recent French history has also been rocked by modern uprisings. There was, of course, the civil unrest of May 1968 that sparked a cultural revolution and provoked political and societal change.
And more recently, the country was shaken by the Yellow Vest movement. What started off as a protest against rising fuel prices snowballed into a movement about inequality, the standard of living, and a disconnect between the ruling elite and everyday men and women.
So is this revolutionary spirit really part of the French psyche?
Well, it's certainly a reputation we have, and definitely part of the national narrative. There's a certain glorification of our revolutionary past, and the fact that time and time again we've risen up as a people to fight power for what we think is right. To dig a little deeper, I'm joined by Stephen Clark, British author of best-selling books like A Year in the Merde, 1,000 Years of Annoying the French, and this book, The French Revolution and What Went Wrong. Now, the French Revolution of 1789 is part of the founding myth of the modern French Republic, and yet your book seems to suggest that might be a little bit of an exaggeration. What did go wrong?
Lots of things went wrong. In fact, if you look at the basic myth of the French Revolution, almost everything is false.
Okay.
So what seems to be taught to the French is that on the 14th of July, 1789, the people rose up, they deposed a tyrannical king, Louis XVI, and from then on, magically, there was liberty, equality, and fraternity. And that is almost entirely false. The French Revolution did inspire a lot of people, yeah, but it kind of went wrong. It went sour. It got really violent. You know, there were thousands of deaths. There was a civil war. People forget there was a civil war. They forget that. They just talk about July the 14th, and they forget the sort of chaos that came afterwards and how difficult it was to create a republic.
What would you say is left of the French revolutionary spirit today?
The French still have a real feeling that they are all revolutionaries and the revolution is still going on, and you know, everything was won on the barricades. This is partly why you see so many riots in Paris, is because basically they're all going back to 1789, you know. But I think, strangely, the French are really conservative. They're not, when they take to the streets, they're usually not demanding change, like in 1789. Usually they're demanding return to the status quo. But I think the revolutionary spirit carries on because the French have understood that the more you complain, the more you show the government that you're unhappy, the better your lifestyle will be. So they're kind of revolutionary and conservative at the same time. They want to protect their lifestyle.
Because would you say that protesting is part of the French DNA? Because, for instance, we often talk about la manifestation, taking to the streets. It's kind of a rite of passage for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Is it just part of our DNA?
It's part now of French life. Before the revolution, it wasn't really part of the DNA. It was something that started in the revolution. So it's something that the French have learnt to do, which is if things are going wrong, you go out in the street and you demonstrate. And it's a thing they've learnt since the revolution and have just carried on doing.
And if you take the French national anthem, for instance, there's one lyric that people tend to chant at football games, etc. It's "Aux armes, citoyens," citizens take up arms. Are the French really still revolutionary at heart, or would they like to be?
Yeah, I think they romanticize. When they say "Aux armes, citoyens," I don't think most French people want to take weapons. They don't want to overthrow the government. They want the people to show the government that this is what we want, and this is how we want you to act. And they kind of influence the government. So it's more evolution than revolution these days, which is quite healthy.
One last question. Do you think there could be another French Revolution on the scale of the 1789 one?
Who knows? I don't know. Well, but now, the French, I think, have understood that, perhaps more than lots of other countries, that democracy and debate are how you change a country. So, a demonstration is part of the political debate. The French politicians know that whenever they do something, there is a risk that the people will take to the streets. Not to overthrow the government, just to express their opinion. And nowadays, they usually don't want revolution. They want to protect the good things in life that they have obtained. And I mean, it must be said that in France, they've obtained a lot of good things. Paid holiday, very high unemployment payment, protected jobs. There's a lot to lose, so there's a lot for the French people to go out there and protect, and that's what they do.
Stephen Clark, thank you so much for being with us on French Connections Plus.
Thanks.
France's revolutionary spirit certainly is still visible today. Symbols born during the French Revolution are everywhere.
Well, there's the French flag, the national anthem, la Marseillaise, and especially the French motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Freedom, equality, and brotherhood.
That's one of the truly unique things about the French revolutionary spirit. The French weren't just fighting for their own national independence.
They wanted to establish universal principles that would set the basis for freedom for human beings everywhere.
Well, that's all the time we have for this French Connections Plus. Thanks for watching. Don't forget, you can always send your questions via tweet at Villeminot or reach out on social media.
And we'll see you soon for another episode of French Connections Plus.